In the summer of 1943, Allied commanders faced a chilling possibility that the Japanese Empire could use Alaska as a northern front to attack the mainland United States. Just months earlier, American forces had endured brutal combat retaking the Aleutian island of Attu, where icy cliffs and fanatical resistance claimed over 3,000 lives. But there was one island left, Kiska, and intelligence suggested it was even more heavily fortified than Attu. To eliminate the threat once and for all, the Allies launched Operation Cottage, an amphibious assault involving more than 35,000 US and Canadian troops. They expected a bloodbath.
By mid-1943, World War II was entering a brutal new phase. The Allies had begun turning the tide in North Africa and the Soviet Union, but the Pacific remained a deadly grind. Island-hopping campaigns were pushing closer to Japan, and American forces faced fierce resistance at every turn. In the shadow of Pearl Harbor, US commanders feared another surprise attack, this time from the north. And they were right to worry. The Japanese had done something no foreign power had managed in modern history. They captured American territory. In June 1942, Japanese forces seized the remote Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, far-flung outposts of Alaska. It was a diversion meant to support their attack on Midway, but the occupation became real. For nearly a year, the US feared the islands could become launch pads for strikes against the Pacific Northwest. That fear turned into bloodshed when the US retook Attu at horrifying cost. The plan was straightforward: bombard Kiska from the air and sea for weeks, then land ground forces to crush whatever remained. The island was believed to be occupied by at least 5,000 Japanese troops, dug in and prepared to fight to the death. Fog constantly blanketed the terrain, making reconnaissance nearly impossible. With limited intel and the memory of Attu fresh in everyone's mind, the Allies moved forward with overwhelming force. The operation would be led by General Charles H. Corlett, a rising US commander known for his aggressive tactics. Battleships moved into position, troops rehearsed landings, everyone was ready for war. On August 15th, under thick fog and miserable weather, the invasion began. US and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. The terrain was jagged, mountainous, and covered in volcanic rock. Then, shots rang out. Explosions echoed through the fog. Chaos erupted as units exchanged fire, landmines detonated, and radio silence deepened the confusion. It was everything the troops expected, a brutal, close-quarters fight for control of the island. But as the hours passed and the smoke began to clear, something didn't add up.
There were no prisoners, no bodies, no enemy equipment. When the fog finally lifted, the horrifying truth came into focus. There was no battle. The Japanese had evacuated weeks earlier under the cover of darkness. The defenders never existed. The entire invasion force had been fighting shadows and itself. By the end of the operation, nearly 200 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded. Not a single shot had been fired by the Japanese. The casualties came entirely from friendly fire, landmines, and accidents. It was one of the most bizarre and tragic chapters in the entire war. A full-scale invasion met by silence, only to result in bloodshed from within. Despite the operation's surreal outcome, Corlett faced no formal reprimand. In fact, he would go on to command divisions in the Central Pacific and later in Europe. The military quietly moved on from the incident, highlighting the successful occupation of Kiska rather than the lack of enemy contact. But within the ranks, the operation left a bitter taste. A reminder that poor intel and environmental fog could be just as deadly as bullets. Operation Cottage was quickly overshadowed by other battles in the Pacific, but it exposed just how dangerous fear, fog, and poor intelligence can be. A massive force prepared for annihilation, and instead fell victim to its own expectations. In the end, the deadliest enemy on Kiska wasn't the Japanese. It was the fog of war itself.
The real tragedy of Operation Cottage wasn't just in the misfire, it was in how quickly it was forgotten. Officially, the mission was labeled a success. The island was secured, the threat removed, and the headlines moved on. But for the men who landed in the fog, fired on their own, and buried comrades without ever seeing an enemy, the experience was far from victorious. It was a brutal reminder that even a flawless plan on paper can unravel in the chaos of war. No major policy changes followed, no significant doctrine was rewritten, and while the incident remains a bizarre footnote in the history of World War II, it underscores a truth that's often overlooked. The most dangerous battlefield isn't always the one filled with enemies. It's the one filled with uncertainty. Operation Cottage didn't just test tactics or logistics. It tested the very limits of trust, clarity, and control under pressure. And in that sense, it revealed how even a war's quietest battle can echo the loudest. Subscribe to Military Briefs for more untold stories, tactical breakdowns, and declassified military history.